There's a moment, most people never talk about it, when you realize the life you planned is gone, and the only thing standing between you and complete collapse is a stranger who had no reason to care. She didn't ask to end up here. She didn't choose this land, this dust, this man with calloused hands and a jaw set like carved stone. A clerical error, a wrong turn, a misdirected letter from an agency that matched women to households across the frontier. That's all it was supposed to be. But the prairie doesn't care about paperwork. And loneliness, real loneliness, the kind that lives in your ribs and won't let you breathe right, doesn't wait for the right address. He could have put her on the next wagon back. She could have gone. Neither of them did. What happened between the morning she stepped off that wagon with one trunk and a folded letter that had the wrong name on it, and the evening 6 months later when she didn't leave, that's the part nobody ever writes down. I'm writing it down. I keep a ledger. Not for cattle counts or feed expenses, though I keep those too, in a separate brown book with a cracked spine. No, the ledger I'm talking about is the one I started the winter my father died, a narrow journal with water-stained covers that I carry in the left breast pocket of my coat. I write down what I see, not what I think, not what I feel, just what I see, described as plain as I can manage it. The habit started as a way to stay sane during the long silences on the ranch. Then it became something else. Evidence, maybe. Proof that the days happened, that the things that moved through them were real. June 14th, I wrote, a woman arrived at Calloway's by mistake, stood in the yard like she was waiting for the earth to correct itself. Her name was Rosalind Vane. And she wasn't supposed to be here. I was mending fence line on the eastern pasture when Diego, my hired hand and the closest thing I had to a friend within 40 miles, rode up with that look on his face. The one he wore when something had gone wrong but hadn't yet turned into a disaster. He had a gift for reading that precise middle distance. "Boss," he said, squinting against the afternoon glare, "there's a woman at the house." I didn't look up from the wire. "What kind of woman?" "The kind with a trunk and a letter." I set down the pliers. The arrangement had been made months ago, a domestic placement through a frontier service agency out of Kansas City. They matched women seeking work and stability in the West with ranch households in need of household management, cooking, or childcare. I had no children. What I had was a kitchen that hadn't been properly cleaned since my housekeeper, Mrs. Purdy, left for her daughter's place in Tulsa the previous autumn. I had submitted a request under the name of my neighbor, Garrett Calloway, who had 3 kids and a house that made my kitchen look like a cathedral. I had done it as a favor. Garrett's wife had passed 2 winters back. He didn't know how to ask for help. I did it for him without telling him, figuring I'd explain once the arrangement was confirmed. The letter of placement went to the wrong man. My name, my address, my yard. She was standing in the shadow of the porch when I rode up. 26, maybe 27. Dark hair pulled back severely, like she'd learned early that anything left loose could be used against her. A brown wool traveling dress that was wrong for the heat but right for a woman who didn't know what she was riding into. One trunk, small enough that she'd carried it herself from the wagon stop. A leather satchel hung from her shoulder. She held a letter. I recognized the agency letterhead from the copy I'd kept in my desk. "You're Mr. Whitmore?" she asked. Her voice was steadier than I expected. Most people arriving for the first time at a remote ranch, after days of wagon travel across open nothing, arrived sounding frayed. "I am," I said, "and you're?" "Rosalind Vane." She held out the letter. "The agency placed me here. I've come to serve as housekeeper and domestic manager for the Whitmore household." She paused, glancing at the house, then back to me. "I was told there were children." I didn't answer right away. Behind me, Diego made a sound that wasn't quite a cough. I took the letter, read it even though I already knew what it said, because having something to look at gave me a moment to think. The agency had simply pulled the wrong name from the file. Garrett's request matched with my address. The kind of mistake that seems impossible until you realize someone is doing this work for 50 ranches at a time with a single ink pen and questionable handwriting. "Miss Vane," I said, "there's been an error." I explained it plainly. The intended placement was for my neighbor Calloway 2 miles east. The mistake was administrative, not personal. I told her I would send word to the agency, arrange her transfer, see that she got to Calloway's by end of week. I watched her face as I said it. She didn't crumble. That was the first thing I noticed. She didn't crumble. There was a tightening around her eyes, a slight compression of her lips, the kind of adjustment a person makes when they are preventing themselves from showing something they cannot afford to show. She looked at the yard, at the house, at the flat, endless horizon behind me. Then she looked at me. "Is the position at the neighbor's confirmed?" she asked. "Not yet," I admitted. "Then where am I meant to go in the meantime?" That was the practical question, and it had a practical answer I didn't love. Nowhere immediately obvious. The wagon that had brought her was long gone. The nearest town with a boarding house was Marlow, 14 miles west, and I wasn't sending a woman alone across 14 miles of open territory in the late afternoon with her single trunk. I told her she could take the spare room for the night. Told her it was a temporary arrangement, not an offer of employment. I showed her the room, small, clean enough, with a window that faced north, and I left her to rest. Then I stood in my kitchen, which was objectively a disgrace, and wrote in my ledger. She didn't flinch. I'm not sure what I expected. Something softer, maybe. She isn't soft. Diego found me there, leaning against the counter with the ledger open. "You're going to send her to Calloway's?" he asked. "That's the plan." "Calloway's a decent man," Diego said, which wasn't quite an answer to my question. "He is." "3 kids," Diego added, "house full of noise." "She came to work," I said. "That's work." Diego nodded slowly, the way he did when he agreed with the logic and disagreed with the conclusion. He'd perfected that nod over years. It drove me quietly insane. "She came down for supper." I hadn't planned to make supper. I'd been planning to eat the last of the cold cornbread from breakfast, which was my general system when I was tired. But she walked into the kitchen, looked at the cornbread, looked at the cold stove, and, without asking permission and without making a production of it, opened the larder, considered what was there, and started cooking. Not in a performed, demonstrative way. Not in a way that said, "Look, I am earning my keep." In the way a person cooks when feeding people is simply what they do next. She found a cast iron pan, dried beans I'd forgotten I had, onion, salt pork. The stove was lit in under 3 minutes. She worked in silence, moving around the kitchen like she was learning its shape through her hands. I sat at the table because leaving felt rude and staying felt strange. "You don't have to do this," I said. "I'm hungry," she replied. "You presumably are as well." Diego appeared in the doorway, drawn by the smell of something actually cooking, and she set 3 plates without being asked. We ate in near silence. The beans were good, better than good, seasoned with something I didn't have a name for that turned what should have been plain food into something that required attention. I wrote in my ledger after she went back upstairs. "She cooked because she was hungry. I need to think about that." Over the next 2 days, I sent word to the agency and to Calloway. The agency confirmed the error. Calloway was slower to respond, not because he was uninterested, but because Calloway communicated with the outside world like a man who had decided written language was a secondary system. Rosalind didn't wait idly. She cleaned the kitchen properly, not cursorily. She reorganized the larder, labeling things in her small, precise handwriting. She found a basket in the barn that no one had touched in years and used it to carry things between the house and the well. She did all of this without announcing it, without asking for approval, without making any indication that she considered it extraordinary. It was as if she had simply decided that chaos was unhelpful and had begun, quietly and methodically, to address it. I found myself structuring my mornings differently, coming in from the pasture earlier than I needed to, finding reasons to pass through the kitchen. I wrote in my ledger on the third day, I should send word to Calloway again. He's slow. On the fourth day I wrote, Diego thinks I'm not sending word to Calloway. He's wrong. I just haven't found a spare writer. On the fifth day, I didn't write anything about Calloway at all. The thing I noticed, because I notice things, it's the habit the ledger built, was that she never relaxed entirely. Even in the kitchen, where she moved with the most confidence, there was something held back, a watchfulness. She sat at meals with her back to a wall when she could manage it. She asked practical questions only, never personal ones. She showed curiosity through her hands touching things, examining them, figuring out how they worked, but almost never through speech. On the fifth evening, I came in from a hard day of sorting calves, filthy and not in a particularly human state of mind, and found her on the porch with the leather satchel open beside her. She was reading a book, not a dime novel, but something with a dense spine. When she heard my boots on the step, she closed it with the same slight, precise motion she used for everything else. "You don't have to stop," I said. I wasn't sure if I was in your way. I looked at the porch, my porch, wide enough for 4 rocking chairs, currently holding one. I think there's room. She didn't reopen the book, but she didn't go inside either. We sat in the cooling air while the sky turned colors that you only get out here, where there's nothing between you and the horizon for miles in every direction. The kind of sky that makes you feel either enormous or very small depending on the day. "What are you reading?" I asked. A pause, then natural history, birds primarily. I looked at her. She had the look of someone who expected to be made fun of for this. "There's a scissor-tailed flycatcher nests in the cottonwood by the creek," I said, "if you want to see one." The pause before she spoke was different from her other pauses, shorter, less guarded. "I'd like that," she said. I wrote in my ledger that night with a slightly unsteady hand, which I attributed to fatigue. Calloway still hasn't written back. The scissortail had 4 eggs last I checked. I didn't mention that to her yet. Calloway's letter arrived on the 7th day. He was grateful for the arrangement, deeply so, and would welcome Miss Vane as soon as she could be transported. He sent apologies for the confusion, praised my thoughtfulness, and mentioned in a postscript that his eldest daughter had been managing the cooking since her mother passed and had started crying every time she had to go into the kitchen because it still smelled like her mother. I read the letter at the kitchen table. Rosalind was outside with the bird book near the cottonwood. I folded the letter. I sat with it a long time. Then I went to the door and called her name, and when she turned, book in hand, squinting slightly against the afternoon light, I had every intention of telling her that the transfer was confirmed. What I said instead was, "The hummingbirds come through in July. You'd want to be here for that." She looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look that reads a person sideways, all the way through. "Mr. Whitmore," she said carefully, "are you offering me the position?" I hadn't thought about it in those terms. The word position made it formal in a way that clarified something I'd been avoiding clarifying. "The kitchen's a disaster," I said. "The ledger on feed costs is 3 months behind. Diego can't cook anything you'd want to eat twice." That isn't an answer. I looked at the cottonwood, at the sky, at my boots. "Then stay," I said, "if you want to." She looked at the folded letter in my hand. She'd noticed it immediately, I realized. She noticed everything, and then she looked at me, and there was a calculation happening behind her eyes that I couldn't fully read. What I could read was this: she was not someone who made decisions out of sentiment. Whatever she decided in the next 10 seconds, she would have decided it. "I'll stay through the month," she said. "We can revisit after." It was not a romantic declaration. It was a month-to-month arrangement proposed by a practical woman to a man who kept a ledger, and hadn't told her why Calloway's letter had made him slow. I went back inside and wrote one line. "She's staying through the month." Then I crossed it out and wrote it again, in capitals, which I have never done in this ledger before. The kind of heat that isn't just temperature, it has texture, weight, intention. The kind that makes the grass go pale and the horses stand still in the shade, and the water in the trough go warm by noon. You stop fighting it after the first week. You just build your days around it, fitting your hardest work into the early hours and the late ones, and letting the middle of the day belong to the heat. Rosalind adapted faster than anyone I'd hired. That was the word I used in my ledger, hired. I'd set a wage, a fair one, and she had accepted it with the same brisk practicality she applied to everything. The word hired kept things ordered, kept the edges of the arrangement defined in a way that felt important. I was writing hired in my ledger more than any word should appear in a single week. Diego noticed. He didn't say anything about it. He just did the nod. She had her routines within the first 10 days, and once she had them, they were hers. Up before me, which I knew because I was an early riser, and yet somehow she was always already in the kitchen when I came down, a cup of coffee waiting at my place at the table. Not set there with ceremony, just there, as though it had always been there. I mentioned once that she didn't need to do that. She looked at me with the expression she reserved for statements that didn't merit a response and said nothing. After breakfast, she managed the house. Late morning she walked, not meandering, purposeful, and she always had the bird book with her. She was filling its margins with her own notes in pencil, small careful observations about the birds she found. The scissor-tailed flycatcher, a pair of painted buntings near the south fence line, a burrowing owl she found near the old well casing that she came back to tell me about with the first purely unself-conscious expression I'd seen on her face. "It looked straight at me," she said, "just straight at me for a full minute." "They do that," I said. "Territorial." "No." She shook her head slightly, and there was something in her voice, a precision she brought when she was correcting not a mistake but a misunderstanding. "It wasn't territorial. It was assessing." I didn't argue with her. I wrote it down. The owl assessed her. I think she's right about this. There is something that happens on a working ranch in July that people from towns don't understand. The work doesn't stop because it's miserable. The cattle still need moving. The fence doesn't repair itself. The water situation demands daily management when the creek level drops. And that year, the creek dropped earlier than usual. I had 3 working hands that month, Diego. A young man named Curly who was strong and uncomplicated, and an older hand named Hatch who had been with my father before he was with me, and who communicated primarily through disapproving silences and the occasional grunt of provisional approval. Between the 4 of us, we were managing a herd larger than made comfortable sense for the acreage, because I'd made a purchasing decision the previous fall that was optimistic. By mid-July, I was writing 12-hour days. I came in one evening too tired to eat, and found Rosalind at the kitchen table, with my feed ledger open in front of her. I stopped in the doorway. She didn't startle. "You've been carrying 2 underweight animals in the north section for 3 weeks," she said, without looking up. "They're pulling the feed rotation off. If you move them to the supplemental pen and adjust the morning distribution, you recover about 60 pounds of feed per week." I looked at her. "You read the feed ledger?" It was on the table. I was curious. She finally looked up. "I grew up on a working sheep station. My father's books looked like yours. I can spot a distribution problem from the pattern of the tallies." I sat down slowly at the other chair. The chair I almost never used because I almost always ate alone. She pushed the ledger toward me and pointed to the column she meant. She was right. She was precisely, demonstrably, unarguably right. and the adjustment she was suggesting would have taken me another 2 weeks to arrive at through my own slower system of realization. Sheep Station, I said. Yorkshire, my father raised Swallowdale. A pause. It's nothing like this. Nothing like what? She looked at the window at the ink-dark Texas night outside. The size of it, the silence. At home the hills hold sound differently. Here it just goes. She made a small gesture, fingers opening, the way you describe something disappearing. I didn't expect to miss the hills. I thought I'd be relieved. It was the most she had said about herself in 3 weeks. I held very still, the way you do when something is approaching that might stop if you move. Were you relieved? I asked. She closed the ledger carefully. Go eat, she said. I kept supper warm. I adjusted the feed rotation the next morning. By the end of the week, both the underweight animals were responding. Hatch, who had watched me move them to the supplemental pen with an expression of puzzled interest, found me at the morning water check. Smart fix, he said. Not mine, I told him. He looked at the house, back at me. The silence he produced was not disapproving this time. It was something closer to the grunt of provisional approval, which from Hatch was extravagant. The trouble started in the 3rd week of July, and it had nothing to do with the ranch. A man came. He arrived on horseback in the late morning while I was out on the east section, and Rosalind was the one who received him. Diego saw it from the barn, a tall man, well-dressed for the territory, with the kind of stillness that isn't peace but its opposite. When I came back in at noon, Rosalind was on the porch with the bird book closed in her lap, which was unusual. She read with it open. Someone came, I said. Yes. Who? She looked at the road a moment. His name is Fletcher Byrne. He's a solicitor, from Kansas City originally, operating out of Amarillo. I waited. My father died in April, she said. There was a debt, a larger one than I knew, against the station, against everything. She said it with no shift in her voice. The voice was flat the way ice is flat, not because it's solid, but because what's moving is underneath. Byrne represents the creditor, she continued. He's been looking for me. He tracked the agency placement. He has documents requiring my signature. They would, she stopped, reset. If I sign them, I acknowledge the debt as personal liability, as my father's heir. And if you don't, then they file in probate court and it takes longer, but the outcome is likely the same. She looked down at the book. He'll come back Thursday. I sat down on the porch steps. She didn't look at me and I didn't look at her. We both looked at the road. Do you have a solicitor? I asked. No. I know a man in Marlow. He's not a specialist in this area, but he's sharp, and he knows someone in Amarillo who is. Mr. Whitmore. Fletcher Byrne doesn't scare me, I said. He should probably know that before Thursday. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, you don't have any obligation here. I know. This isn't your. I know that too. The thing I didn't say was what I wrote in the ledger that evening, alone in the kitchen, with the lamp turned low. She handles everything in isolation. I think it's the only way she knows. I don't think she's ever had anyone stand in front of something with her. I don't know if she'll let me. I'd like to try. The next morning I rode to Marlow before first light, and was back by noon with a name and the beginning of a letter to the Amarillo solicitor. I left the letter on the kitchen table. Rosalind found it when she came in from her morning walk. She read it standing up, still holding the bird book. She read it twice. Then she set it down and went to the stove and checked the pot that was already fine and didn't need checking, and when she turned back around her face was doing something complicated. You went this morning, she said. Before the heat, it's a good time to ride. You didn't tell me you were going. I didn't want an argument before dawn. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. Almost. The man in Amarillo, she started. Read the letter. His record is in the second paragraph. She picked it up again and read the second paragraph. This will cost, she said. I know. I can't accept. Then consider it an advance against wages, I said, and stop worrying about it before Thursday, because you need to be able to think clearly when Byrne gets here. She looked at me for a long time, the look she used when she was reading all the way through a person. I held still. You write everything down, she said finally. Yes. Do you write about this? About, she gestured vaguely at the kitchen, at the table, at the letter, at the space between us. Sometimes. What do you write? I thought about what I'd written the night before. I think she's never had anyone stand in front of something with her. Observations, I said. She looked at me one moment longer. Then she picked up the letter, folded it precisely, and put it in her satchel. Thursday, she said, we'll see. Thursday came. Byrne came with it. He was smoother in person than his first visit had implied, the kind of smooth that is more warning than welcome. He sat at my kitchen table like a man who was accustomed to other people's kitchens being his office. Rosalind sat across from him. I sat beside her. I said nothing. I was there the way a fence line is there, defining the edge of something. She had reviewed the letter from the Amarillo solicitor twice the night before. I had listened from the next room without being asked to, and she had not told me to leave. When Byrne presented his documents, she did not reach for the pen. Mr. Byrne, she said, in the voice she used when she was being precisely understood, I've been advised that the instrument you're asking me to sign constitutes a waiver of estate protections under the current probate guidelines. I'm not signing anything today. My legal representative will be in contact. Byrne smiled the way men smile when they're used to winning eventually. Miss Vane, the longer this takes, the more thoroughly it'll be examined, she said. I know. He looked at me. I looked back. He left. The porch was quiet afterward. She sat with the bird book open on her knee, not reading, just holding it. You were steady, I said. I was terrified, she said. Those aren't opposites. She was quiet for a moment. Then she turned a page of the book she hadn't been reading, and I saw her hand wasn't entirely still, and I thought, good. Not because I wanted her afraid, but because people who feel nothing make me uneasy, and she had never felt like nothing. I went inside and wrote in my ledger. She wasn't soft, but she shook a little after. I think I'm glad I know that. August broke open like a wound. That's the only way I know to describe an August in that part of Texas. Not cruel exactly, but honest in a way that doesn't spare you. The grass went from pale to gray. The creek dropped to a slow brown thread. The heat pressed down not just on the land, but inside things. Inside the barns. Inside the house. Inside the long silences between people who had been living in close proximity for 2 months, and had started to know each other through the gaps and not just the words. I wrote less in the ledger in August, not because less was happening, because more was happening than I knew how to describe plainly, and I had built the ledger as a place for plain description. What I wrote instead was fragments. She laughs at Diego's stories, not politely. Genuinely, I didn't know she could laugh like that. The Birtwing owl is back at the well casing. She knows its schedule now. She asked me tonight what my father was like. I didn't expect the question. The Amarillo solicitor, whose name was Medlock, was a tenacious man. By early August, he had established that the personal liability claim Byrne's client was pressing was built on a misclassification of the estate's debt instrument. It would not be quick, and it would not be free, but it was survivable. Rosalind came to tell me this on a Tuesday evening. She found me at the kitchen table with the ledger, the livestock one this time, not the observation one, and she sat down across from me and said, Medlock thinks we can keep it out of personal liability. It'll likely settle in the estate. I'll lose the station, but I won't lose. She stopped. Everything else, I offered. Everything else, she agreed. She looked at the table. There was something in her face I hadn't seen before in this context. Not relief exactly, but the thing that comes when you've been bracing for impact for so long that not being hit feels like its own kind of shock. I know what you're going to say, she said. Do you? That I should have fought this sooner, that I should have. That's not what I was going to say. She looked up. I was going to say that Medlock charges a flat rate on settlements, I said, which is significantly less than his hourly rate on contested hearings, which is what I'd been planning for. So this is financially better. She looked at me. For the advance against wages, I said, the math works out. She made the almost laugh sound again. Then it became an actual laugh, brief, surprised, real. And then she pressed her lips together and looked at the window, and when she looked back her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the lamplight. You keep track of everything, she said. It's the ledger habit. Even, she stopped again. She had a way of stopping that wasn't incompleteness. It was precision. She stopped when the words available weren't exactly the right ones. Even this, I offered. She nodded slightly. Even this, I said. What happened next I'm going to write down plainly, because the ledger taught me that plain description is sometimes the only honest kind. She asked what I'd written about her. Not demanded, asked, quiet and direct, in the way she asked things when the answer genuinely mattered. I got the observation ledger from my coat pocket. I put it on the table between us. I didn't open it, she didn't reach for it, we both looked at it. I don't think I should read it, she said after a moment. Probably not, I agreed. But you wrote about me. From the day you arrived, I said, it's what the ledger is for, what I see. And what did you? She put her hand flat on the cover of the ledger, not opening it, just touching it. What did you see? I thought about all of it, the way she didn't crumble, the way she cooked because she was hungry, the hand that wasn't entirely still after Byrne left, the burrowing owl she told me about with her face open for the first time. Someone who handles everything alone, I said, because it's the only system she's ever had. She didn't say anything. And someone, I said more quietly, who is maybe reconsidering that system. The kitchen was very still. Outside, the August night was full of sound, insects, the distant lowing from the pasture, the creak of the windmill. But in the kitchen there was just the lamp and the ledger and two people sitting at a table with the space between them changed. The month ended 3 weeks ago, she said. We said we'd revisit. We didn't revisit. No, a pause. I didn't want to. I didn't push. I noticed, another pause. That was, she stopped, restarted. That was the right thing. I nodded. She looked at the ledger, then she looked at me. If I stay, she said, I'm not, she searched for the word. I'm not a person who becomes decorative, who fades into someone else's life. I know. You'd have to understand that, actually understand it. The feed ledger is 3 months ahead because of you, I said. Hatch approved of you, which requires more from a person than most people can manage. Diego thinks you're the best thing to happen to this ranch since electricity, which we don't have yet, but the point stands. I paused. I don't want decorative. I have a pretty good look at what you actually are. The almost laugh, the actual laugh, then quiet. I have conditions, she said. I'd expect nothing less. She stayed. Not as hired help. That arrangement had quietly dissolved somewhere in the middle of the month without either of us marking the exact moment. She stayed as herself, which was the only way she knew how to stay, and it turned out that was exactly what the ranch needed and exactly what I didn't know I needed, and exactly what the ledger had been recording, entry by careful entry, without me fully understanding what it was building toward. The scissor-tailed flycatcher nested through August. The hummingbirds came through exactly when I told her they would, and she stood at the kitchen window watching them with the bird book in her hand and the pencil moving in the margin, and I stood behind her at a reasonable distance and watched her watch them. Diego found a reason to be in the kitchen that morning. Hatch happened to be checking something near the porch window. Both of them, I noticed, were smiling in the direction of a wall. In September, the Medlock settlement was reached. Rosalind stood on the porch the morning after the final paperwork was filed, and I watched her look at the horizon for a long time. The grief was there, you could see it in the set of her shoulders, the particular stillness. The sheep station in Yorkshire was gone, her father's land, the hills that held sound differently. I didn't say anything useful. I'm not a man who talks well into grief. What I did was bring a second cup of coffee and sit on the porch step below her, and I stayed there. After a while, she sat down on the step beside me. "He would have liked this," she said. "Your father." "The owl," she said. "He liked birds. I didn't know that about him when I was a child. I found out from his books after." We drank the coffee. "Tell me about him," I said. And she did. She talked for an hour and a half, in the cooling September morning, about a sheep farmer in Yorkshire she had loved imperfectly and known incompletely, the way most of us love and know the people closest to us. She talked about his handwriting, which was terrible, and his instinct with weather, which was uncanny, and the way he used to stand at the high edge of the north pasture in the late afternoon and just look at everything he'd built. She talked about how the debt had probably started in a bad year. She was too young to remember. She talked about how she wished she'd known sooner, which meant she wished she could have helped, which meant she loved him in a specific and practical way that I recognized because it was the only way I knew how to love things too. When she was done, the morning was bright and the birds were moving. She looked at me. "Your turn," she said. So I told her about my father. The ledger entry from that evening is the longest I've written since I started keeping it. It runs for 6 pages. It covers the morning, the conversation, the way the light moved. It covers things I noticed about her face while she talked, the way grief and love looked the same from a certain angle. It covers things she said about her father that I didn't want to forget. At the end, I wrote a single observation. Not about the ranch, not about the arrangement, not about anything practical. She is the kind of person the prairie makes or breaks. It hasn't broken her. I'm not sure she even knows yet what it's made her. I think I'll have a long time to find out. Then I closed the ledger. Outside, the scissortail made one last pass before dusk, that long, elegant tail catching the last of the August light. The burrowing owl was still at the well casing when we checked the next morning. She'd named it at some point without telling me. She said the name out loud once, absently, and then didn't say it again. I wrote it in the ledger. I didn't ask her about it. Some things don't need asking.